I never thought a parking space could cost someone more than a brand new truck. But looking back now, that's exactly what happened. The funny thing is, none of it started with some big neighborhood feud, some long-running property dispute, or a dramatic argument over a fence line. It started with a driveway. Just a driveway. And one man who somehow convinced himself that because he could see it, he was entitled to use it. When I bought my house in a small town outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, one of the first things I loved about it was the driveway. That probably sounds ridiculous, but if you've ever worked with your hands for a living, you'll understand. I owned a landscaping business back then, and every day I was hauling trailers, equipment, toolboxes, and materials. The driveway stretched nearly 80 feet from the road to my detached garage, wide enough for my work truck, my wife's SUV, and still enough room for visitors. It was private, practical, and honestly one of the reasons I chose that house over several others. My next-door neighbor, however, was a man named Derek Collins. Derek had lived there longer than anyone else on the block. He was one of those guys who always acted like seniority gave him authority. If a package was delivered to the wrong porch, Derek had an opinion. If someone planted flowers he didn't like, Derek had an opinion. If a kid rode a bike too fast, Derek definitely had an opinion. Most people tolerated him because arguing with him felt like arguing with a brick wall that somehow had access to a microphone. For the first few months after moving in, we barely interacted. A wave here, a nod there. Nothing unusual. Then one Monday morning, I walked outside carrying my coffee and nearly dropped it. Sitting right in the middle of my driveway was a silver pickup truck. Not near the edge. Not partially over the line. Right in the center, like it belonged there. I stood there for a second, genuinely confused. My first thought was maybe someone had broken down. My second thought was maybe a visitor had parked in the wrong spot. I walked next door and knocked on Derek's door. He opened it wearing a stained Broncos t-shirt and looked annoyed before I even said anything. "Morning," I said. "Hey, that silver truck in my driveway, is it yours?" He glanced toward it and shrugged. "Yeah. Any reason it's parked in my driveway? Just needed somewhere to leave it for a few hours." I laughed awkwardly because I assumed he was joking. He wasn't. "Well, could you move it? I'll get to it later." That was the entire conversation. No apology. No explanation. Just confidence. The kind of confidence people have when they've already decided your opinion doesn't matter. Still, I didn't want problems. Every neighborhood has enough drama already, and I had zero interest in creating more. So I let it go. A few hours later, the truck disappeared and life moved on. Or at least I thought it did. 2 days later, it was back. Same truck, same driveway, same ridiculous position right in the center. This time I walked over immediately. Derek was washing something in his garage when I approached. "Hey," I said, "I need you to stop parking in my driveway." He didn't even look up. "It's only temporary. It's private property. You're not using it right now." I remember staring at him for a second because I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. Then he finally looked at me and smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people use when they're trying to tell you they're smarter than you. "Relax," he said. "It's not hurting anything." That sentence stuck with me. Not because it was particularly insulting, but because it revealed exactly how he viewed the situation. In his mind, if something wasn't hurting him, then it wasn't a problem. My inconvenience didn't matter. My property rights didn't matter. My requests didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was what was easiest for Derek. I went home irritated, but I still tried to be reasonable. A week later, when it happened again, I gave him one final warning. I remember standing at the edge of the driveway as evening sunlight hit the truck's windshield. "Derek," I said, "I'm serious. Stop parking here. Next time I'm not coming over to ask." He folded his arms. "You threatening me?" "No, I'm informing you." He laughed, actually laughed, then turned around and walked back into his garage. Standing there, I had a strange feeling that would become very familiar over the next year. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was the realization that I was dealing with someone who genuinely believed rules only applied to other people. And people like that usually learn lessons the hard way. 3 days later, I came home from work and found the truck sitting there again, exactly where I'd told him not to park. This time I didn't walk next door. I didn't argue. I didn't knock on his door. Instead, I pulled out my phone and called a towing company. 45 minutes later, A tow truck rolled slowly down the street. I stood on my porch as the driver climbed out, checked the address, and smiled. "Private property?" he asked. "Very private property," I replied. 20 minutes later, the silver pickup disappeared around the corner, hanging from the back of a tow truck. And that was the moment this entire story truly began. The reaction came faster than I expected. Around 7 that evening, I heard pounding on my front door so hard it rattled the glass panels beside it. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Derek stood there red-faced, breathing heavily, looking like a man who had just discovered gravity was optional and suddenly became very upset when it started working again. "Where's my truck?" he demanded. I leaned against the doorframe. "Probably at the impound lot by now." For a second, he just stared at me. Then his face twisted. "You want my truck towed? I had a vehicle removed from my property. You could have warned me." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I'd warned him so many times that hearing him say that felt surreal. "Derek, I've warned you 3 separate times. I didn't think you'd actually do it." There it was, the real answer. Not that he didn't understand. Not that he forgot. He simply believed consequences were something that happened to other people. "Well," I said, "now you know." He muttered a few things I won't repeat and stormed away. The next morning, my wife Emily asked what all the yelling had been about. When I explained everything, she set down her coffee and just stared at me. "You know this isn't over, right?" she said. Looking back, she was absolutely right. 2 weeks later, I came home and saw the silver truck sitting in my driveway again. Same spot, same attitude. It was almost impressive. Most people would feel embarrassed after paying a towing bill. Derek apparently treated it like a parking subscription. I didn't even get out of my truck right away. I just sat there, looked at the vehicle, sighed, and called the towing company. The dispatcher answered. "Roadside recovery." "Yeah," I said. "I need a tow." 40 minutes later, the truck disappeared for the second time. That evening, Derek didn't even bother knocking on my door. He stood in his yard, yelling loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "You're acting like a child," he shouted. I stepped onto my porch, then stopped parking in my driveway. A few neighbors peeked through windows. One woman walking her dog actually stopped to watch. Derek pointed toward me dramatically like a politician making a campaign speech. Normal people talk things out. Normal people don't park on someone else's property. That ended the conversation, mostly because he had no response. The third tow happened the following month. The fourth happened 3 weeks after that. By then, something interesting started happening around the neighborhood. People began noticing. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before suddenly brought it up. One afternoon, I was mowing my lawn when an older man named Frank from across the street wandered over. "Is that the same truck?" he asked. "Unfortunately." He chuckled. "You know he spent more on towing fees than a monthly car payment by now. Apparently, he's committed to the cause." Frank laughed so hard he nearly dropped his drink. The thing about repeated bad decisions is that eventually they become entertainment for everyone watching. By the time tow number 5 happened, even the drivers seemed amused. The same company handled every removal because they kept records and knew the situation. One driver named Mike stepped out of his truck one afternoon, looked at the silver pickup, and shook his head. "This guy again? This guy again." "Honestly," Mike said, hooking up the vehicle, "I'm starting to think he enjoys seeing us. At this point, I think it's personal." Mike laughed. "Well, he's helping pay for my kids' college fund." The truck disappeared once more. Summer rolled on. Then Derek decided to get creative. Apparently getting towed repeatedly wasn't enough. He developed a new strategy. Instead of parking completely in my driveway, he started parking halfway into it. His front tires would be on my property, while the rear half remained near the street. It was one of those ideas that probably sounded brilliant in his head. Like somehow trespassing, less was no longer trespassing. The first time I saw it, I actually walked around the truck trying to understand the logic. Then I laughed and called the tow company. Removal number 6. When Derek came home that evening, he marched across his lawn and pointed toward the empty space. "That's ridiculous," he shouted. "Half the truck wasn't even on your property. The other half was. You're abusing the system. You're abusing my driveway." He looked genuinely offended, which somehow made the situation even funnier. Tow 7 followed a few weeks later. Then 8. Then 9. Somewhere around number 10, the entire conflict stopped feeling like an argument and started feeling like a bizarre ritual. Derek would park. I'd call. The truck would vanish. A bill would arrive. Then somehow he'd convince himself next time would be different. One Saturday afternoon, Emily and I were sitting on the back patio when my phone rang. It was Mike from a towing company. "Don't tell me," I said when I answered. "Silver pickup?" Mike laughed. "Actually, I was calling because dispatch saw your address pop up again and want to know if we're doing this today." I looked through the side gate, and there it was. Derek's truck sitting partially across the driveway entrance. "Yep," I said. "We're doing this today." Emily nearly spilled her drink laughing. At this point, even she couldn't believe it anymore. Tow numbers 11 and 12 happened before the end of fall. Every time I thought surely this was the one that would finally convince him, I was wrong. Then came what the neighborhood still refers to as the barbecue incident. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. Derek was hosting a huge family gathering. Cars lined both sides of the street. Music played from speakers in his backyard. Kids ran through sprinklers. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I glanced outside and saw the silver pickup parked directly in the center of my driveway. Again, I honestly couldn't believe it. Not after 12 previous removals. Not after months of bills. Not after every argument. I remember standing in my kitchen window, staring at it, while Emily shook her head beside me. "He's not actually that dumb, is he?" she asked. "I don't know anymore." Then I picked up my phone. 45 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. What happened next looked like a scene from a comedy movie. Nearly 20 relatives stood outside, talking when Mike's truck pulled up. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Children pointed. Mike climbed out calmly, attached the hooks, and began lifting the pickup. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. It was like watching a wildlife documentary, where everyone suddenly realizes the lion has chosen a target. Then Derek came running from the backyard. The look on his face was priceless. "Are you kidding me?" he yelled. Mike didn't even answer. He simply finished securing the truck and climbed back into the cab. The pickup rolled away while every member of Derek's family watched. I still remember one older woman shaking her head at him with the disappointment only a grandmother can deliver. The barbecue got noticeably quieter after that. Over the following winter, the removals continued. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Snow didn't stop me. Ice didn't stop me. Freezing temperatures didn't stop me. I think Derek genuinely believed bad weather would somehow make me surrender. Instead, every time his truck appeared, I made the same phone call. By then, dispatch didn't even need my explanation anymore. I'd give them my address, and they'd immediately say, "Truck again." And I'd answer, "Truck again." It became our version of small talk. Then came removal 19 during a miserable rainstorm, followed by number 20 on a freezing morning before sunrise. By the time Derek woke up, the truck was already gone. 21 happened on a weekend. 22 happened about 3 weeks later. After that one, something changed. The truck disappeared. Days passed, then weeks. For the first time in nearly a year, my driveway remained completely empty except for my own vehicles. No surprise visitor. No silver pickup. No tow truck. No arguments. Nothing. Emily started believing the whole thing was finally over. Frank from across the street joked that maybe Derek had finally discovered public parking. Even I began thinking he'd learned his lesson at last. And honestly, I wanted to believe it too. Because as ridiculous as the situation had become, I was tired of it. Tired of the conflict. Tired of the phone calls. Tired of looking out my window, wondering what new nonsense awaited me. For nearly a month, everything stayed peaceful. Then one evening after work, I turned into my driveway and immediately felt my stomach drop. Sitting dead center in the exact same spot where this entire saga had begun was the silver pickup truck, waiting for me like an old enemy who had somehow survived the final battle. And in that moment, I realized the story wasn't over quite yet. For a few seconds, I just sat there behind the wheel staring at the truck. I wish I could tell you I felt angry, but honestly, by that point, anger had burned itself out months earlier. What I felt was something closer to disbelief. It was like watching a grown man touch a hot stove for the 23rd time and still acting surprised when it burned him. The silver pickup sat there right in the middle of my driveway, perfectly positioned as if the previous year had never happened. As if 22 towing bills, 22 storage fees, countless arguments, and endless embarrassment had all been some kind of collective hallucination. I shut off the engine, leaned back in my seat, and laughed. Not loudly, just enough to shake my head. Emily was standing in the garage when I walked in. She saw my expression immediately. No. Yes. He's back. He's back. She looked toward the driveway through the open garage door and covered her face. At this point, I think he's doing it just to keep the tradition alive. Well, I said, pulling out my phone. I'd hate to disappoint him. I made the call. The dispatcher answered before the first ring had fully ended. Roadside recovery. Truck again. There was a pause. Then laughter. We'll be there in 40 minutes. Even now, years later, that conversation still makes me smile. Not because I enjoyed the situation, but because everyone involved seemed to understand how absurd it had become. 40 minutes later, the familiar tow truck rolled into the neighborhood. Mike climbed out, took one look at the pickup, and shook his head. Number 23? Number 23. That's ought to be some kind of record. If it isn't, I don't want to meet the guy who holds it. Mike laughed, hooked up the truck, and a few minutes later the silver pickup disappeared for what would turn out to be the final time. Derek never came to my door afterward. No angry shouting. No dramatic confrontation. No accusations. Nothing. That silence was almost stranger than the arguments. Days passed, then another week. The truck didn't return. 2 weeks later, I noticed Derek spending more time outside than usual. He'd stand in his yard staring at the side of his house, occasionally talking to contractors who would stop by carrying clipboards. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then one Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of machinery. Concrete trucks, excavators, construction crews. When I looked outside, several workers were unloading equipment beside Derek's garage. Over the next few days, the project slowly revealed itself. They weren't repairing anything. They weren't remodeling. They were building. Specifically, they were pouring a large concrete extension beside his existing driveway. By the end of the week, the shape was obvious. A massive new parking area stretched alongside his garage, big enough for multiple vehicles, trailers, and probably a small boat if he wanted one. I remember standing by the mailbox one afternoon when Frank wandered over from across the street. We both watched the construction crew finishing the concrete work. Frank folded his arms and whistled. That can't be cheap. No, think it's cheaper than 23 towing bills. I thought about it for a second. Probably not. Frank laughed so hard he nearly dropped his newspaper. The truth is, I never asked Derek how much the project cost. It wasn't my business. But anyone who has dealt with concrete work knows it wasn't a small expense. Permits, labor, materials, excavation, finishing work, it added up quickly. Yet as I watched the project take shape, I couldn't help noticing something ironic. The solution had always been available. He could have built additional parking from the beginning. He could have parked on the street. He could have rented storage. He could have done 100 different things. Instead, he spent over a year fighting a battle that never needed to exist. A few weeks later, the construction crews left. The concrete cured. The equipment disappeared. And for the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, Derek's truck had a permanent home that wasn't my driveway. From that day forward, I never saw it on my property again. Not once. No partial parking. No creative loopholes. No surprise appearances. Just peace. Looking back now, the whole thing feels almost impossible to believe. If someone else told me this story, I'd probably assume they were exaggerating. 23 removals sounds ridiculous because it is ridiculous. Most people learn after one consequence. Some stubborn people learn after 2 or 3. But 23? That's commitment on a level I still struggle to understand. Yet the part that sticks with me isn't the towing bills or the arguments. It's the mindset behind them. Somewhere along the way, Derek became so determined not to admit he was wrong that he kept making the same mistake over and over, each time paying more than the last. Pride can be expensive, sometimes far more expensive than solving the actual problem. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The driveway was never the issue. The truck wasn't the issue. The issue was a man who couldn't stand being told no. Eventually, reality won, but not before sending him 23 separate invoices. Every now and then I still drive past that old neighborhood when I'm in the area. The parking extension is still there. The truck is usually parked exactly where it belongs. And every time I see it, I find myself wondering the same thing. Did he finally learn a lesson? Or did he simply run out of ways to avoid it? Honestly, I'm still not sure. But now I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have kept calling the tow company every single time, or would you have handled it differently? And more importantly, after the third or fourth tow, who do you think was really being stubborn? Me for refusing to let it go, or Derek for refusing to stay out of a driveway that was never his in the first place? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling people are going to be divided on this one.